morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege to be here for this seminar. And so right at the outset, I would like to thank Center for China Analysis and Strategy, CAS, as well as Department of Defense and Strategic Studies for having invited me here. So to start off with, firstly, prior to the second decade of this century, China was hiding its strength and biding its time. But having acquired the necessary economic and military muscle, China has adopted a more visible, assertive, and an aggressive posture under Xi Jinping. So there is now a need to think beyond the rise of China and its implications. At the global level, China is not rising, but has already risen. It is a resurgent superpower, an established peer competitor, and a strategic challenger to the United States. And with a GDP of $18 trillion, it may be behind the US, but is ahead of it in purchasing power parity. So from trade and technology to diplomacy and defense, China is now a formidable global power, setting agendas, reshaping institutions, and challenging the existing order. Similarly, we are beyond assessing the implications of the rise. We need to actually evaluate the consequences of its rise that have already started to manifest in the geopolitical, geoeconomic, and military spheres, and find appropriate counters to them. Okay, so the sub-theme of this seminar is a little abstract, and hence I wish to tell you upfront what I wish to convey. While a security equilibrium is desirable, the relations today are in a state of strategic impasse. The primary factor for this state is ineffective deterrence, for which there are reasons. The extant policy reflects these shortcomings. So unless we factor in the primary instrument for deterrence, we will not be able to have a deterrent policy. And it is actually going to be a deterrent policy that will provide us the necessary security equilibrium and get us peace and stability for our growth and economic development. At the regional level, India-China relations are strained and marked by deep mutual distrust due to persistent border standoffs and competing strategic interests. So what would a security equilibrium between two nations entail? It entails a state of strategic balance where neither side has a clear advantage and both perceive the costs of initiating conflict as outweighing the benefits. The balance is maintained through comparable military capabilities, mutual deterrence, and diplomatic engagement. Equilibrium helps prevent escalation, fosters stability, and encourages dialogue over confrontation. Now, sustaining a security equilibrium requires transparency, confidence-building measures, and crisis communication channels to avoid unintended escalation, especially in regions with historical or territorial disputes. So when it comes to India-China relations, it is evident that we are nowhere close to a security equilibrium, but are in a state of imbalance. The imbalance in relations are in the form of a strategic impasse, wherein it is an uneasy situation where opposing forces halt confrontational activity and interact with each other politically or militarily. Hence, disputes remain unresolved, but have the potential for escalation, and the status quo is maintained through force. So while equilibrium reflects a managed and a stable relationship, an impasse indicates unresolved tension and an unstable status quo, often maintained by force or through mutual caution. The impasse in our case is because of the unresolved border dispute. But over the years, due to the impasse, China has gained territorial advantage through their incursions. So the question that arises is, if we resolve the present border dispute, will we achieve equilibrium? The answer is perhaps no, as the uncomfortable truth is that China is both a revanchist and a revisionist power and will continue to remain so. revanchist because it seeks to reclaim lost territory and prestige driven by historical grievances or nationalist sentiment, and it often goes back to King dynasty to stake its territorial claims. Revisionist because it seeks to alter the existing international order to achieve its interest by challenging established borders, institutions, and power dynamics. So at the global level, China challenges the US, but at the regional level, it aims to negate the rise of India and keep it off balance. Now, the primary factors that preclude a security equilibrium is the absence of credible deterrence. So what is deterrence? Deterrence is the strategic use of threat, primarily military power, to prevent an adversary from taking some unwanted actions by convincing them that the costs will far outweigh any potential gains. It is based on principles of credibility, capability, and communication. And it is essential that the adversary believes that its opponent has the means, the will, and the intent to respond effectively. So why is deterrence essential? Deterrence is essential as it promotes stability between nation states and prevents escalation of conflicts. When both sides possess credible deterrent capabilities, the risk of aggression is reduced because initiating a conflict by either side becomes too costly or uncertain. It acts as a psychological and a strategic restraint, encouraging states to resolve disputes through diplomacy rather than force. Now, in regions with historical tensions or unresolved borders, deterrence helps preserve peace, manage rivalries, and maintain a balance of power, ensuring that no state can dominate or coerce another without facing significant consequences. So how can deterrence be established? Deterrence can be established through a combination of credible military capability, clear communication, and a demonstrated political will. So it includes maintaining strong armed forces, particularly in critical domains like air power, cyber, and air defense. Joint military exercises and robust border infrastructure signal readiness. Intelligence and surveillance enhance response capabilities. And strategic alliances and defense partnerships actually strengthen deterrence. And a clear articulation of red lines and doctrines ensures that the adversaries understand the costs of aggression. So what are the consequences of ineffective deterrence? India's inability to establish effective deterrence vis-a-vis China has led to repeated border incursions along the LAC. The lack of credible deterrence has also emboldened China to pursue salami slicing tactics, incrementally altering the status quo without triggering a full-scale conflict. China has exploited India's infrastructure gaps, limited air power employment, and asymmetric force mobilization to gain tactical advantages. Politically, this weakens India's regional posture and challenges its image as a counterbalance to China in Asia. China's strategy involves creating strategic ambiguity, testing India's threshold for response, and consolidating gains through quick military and diplomatic maneuvers. The cumulative effect undermines India's strategic credibility. It shifts the local power balance in China's favor and complicates future diplomatic negotiations by establishing facts on the ground, making reversal more difficult without significant escalation or cost. Now, these consequences are being felt in eastern Ladakh. So while we describe the situation as stable and sensitive, the situation is actually critical in Depsang. So why have we not been able to establish deterrence in our case? So India's lack of deterrence against China stems from several factors. Okay. First is the defense budget. If you see the average defense budget for the last 10 years, it's just about 1.6%, of course, minus the salaries and the pensions. This inadequate funding undermines both the real capability and psychological impact necessary to deter threats, reducing flexibility and inviting risks. The second is liberal and idealistic views on war. The political class and the bureaucracy in general seem to believe that in a globalized and an interdependent world, the likelihood of war is going to be less. These views emphasize diplomacy and cooperation and downplay the role of the military force. It leads to underinvestment in defense, thereby weakening deterrence. The post-World War II global order, in fact, forbade territorial conquest by expansionism. However, you see in recent times, the territorial annexation in Crimea and Ukraine are actually being legitimized through agreements. This could encourage revanchist powers, and in this case, the China is not going to be found wanting in it. Next is economic engagement. It is strongly believed that economic engagements can avert wars by creating dependencies. Now, this has proved to be wrong. Our bilateral trade has increased to almost about $130 billion, and yet you seem to have skirmishes at routine intervals. Diplomacy. The role of diplomacy is to diffuse crisis situations, but there are limits. It is worthwhile to remember the observation of George Shultz, the foreign secretary during Reagan's time, who observed that negotiations are a euphemism for capitalism, capitulation, if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. Assessment of threats. Conceptual ambiguity between threats, challenges, and interests leads to misaligned priorities, inefficient resource allocation, delayed responses, and a diluted focus in addressing real threats. In the strategy framework of ends, ways, and means, in the absence of clearly defined threats or ends, the means become the ends. So you keep acquiring capacity which may or may not be of use. Prioritization of threats. Merging or confusing different categories of risks and threats leads to threat conflation, leading to non-prioritization of threats. Lack of inter-service synergy. This is there in all the armed forces in the world, arising from differing views and disagreements on the ends and means, which inhibit formulation of an integrated, cohesive strategy. Next is air power blindness. In our nation, there is inadequate comprehension and an institutional underestimation of the strategic potential of air power. Winston Churchill had remarked that air power is the most difficult military force to measure or even express in precise terms. That statement underscored the complexities in quantifying and articulating the effectiveness and potential of air power within military operations. Other factors such as unsubstantiated fears of escalation and cultural constraint have resulted in its non-use, leading to an air power blindness over the years. This results in underutilization of a critical strategic asset, reduces response options, and allows adversaries to exploit aerial initiative and superiority. External alliances. Absence of a supporting security pillar for any alliance makes it ineffective as far as deterrence is concerned. A case in point is Quad. And strategy. As far as strategy is concerned, we are nowhere close to deterrent strategies of punishment and denial. Okay. So what is India's policy towards China? India's policy towards China can best be described as a hybrid approach, combining elements of strategic restraint, accommodation, and a limited policy of denial, rather than outright appeasement or full confrontation. While not overtly Fabian in classical sense, India's approach does reflect a cautious strategy aimed at avoiding direct military escalation, especially given the asymmetries in economic and military capabilities, notably in air power and border infrastructure. Despite provocative Chinese actions along the LAC, India has often responded with measured diplomatic and military steps of engaging in talks, reinforcing the military posture, and increasing the infrastructure. The restraint stems from a recognition of the risks involved in full-scale conflict and the need to prioritize economic development and growth. So India's policy thus reflects a kind of a balancing act of not denying threats, but not fully confronting them either. The denial appears in rhetoric and public messaging, wherein the seriousness of incursions is underplayed, possibly to maintain internal cohesion and an international image while maintaining space for diplomacy. However, this policy has shortfalls and has come at a price. So if we are to avoid any further subtractions in our territory and avoid erosion of our sovereignty, the policy needs a review and a change. In the years to come, China will get more belligerent. So more of the same is not going to work. Neither should we be inveigled by the peaceful overtures of China for a dragon and an elephant tango or a dance. What is required is a deterrent policy through inclusion of the military instrument for deterrence, which is air power. When I say air power, it is the aggregated air power of all the three services. So why is air power important? Air power is considered a primary instrument of deterrence because of its inherent speed, reach, flexibility, precision, making it uniquely suited to project power across land, sea, and other domains. In deterrence, the ability to inflict swift and credible punishment is crucial. Air power provides the capability to target critical infrastructure, command centers, and supply lines. Now, this enhances the nation's first and second strike options, increasing the cost for any potential aggressor. Air power also enables intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, allowing early detection of threats, enabling informed and timely responses that are an essential component of credible deterrence. In the modern joint warfare environment, air power integrates with ground and naval forces, providing support and amplification of deterrent effects across all domains. Further, the visible deployment of air assets during crisis sends a strong political signal showcasing resolve without crossing escalation thresholds. Thus, air power's psychological, strategic, and operational advantages make it central to establishing and sustaining effective deterrence. Now, in our case, the air power asymmetry vis-a-vis China is significant. The Air Chief has already voiced his concern over the perilous state of our depleting fighter fleet. The LCA Mark Is that are required in large numbers are yet to materialize. The LCA Mark II will only be available perhaps by 2030, and the AMCA is possibly going to see the first flight only in 2035. On the other hand, PLAF has already inducted two fifth-generation fighters, the J-20, J-35, and further they are flight testing two sixth-generation fighters, the J-36 and the J-50. While they have 200 fifth-generation fighters today, this strength is likely to go up to 1,000 by 2030. To make matters worse, China has offered 40 J-35s, with a recent talk also of the Chinese being amenable to supply J-36, a sixth-generation aircraft, to Pakistan by 2030. Add to it our low numbers of force multipliers like the refuelers, AWACS, and AEWCs does not make a good picture. So what is the impact? The adverse asymmetry in air power significantly favors China, enhancing its ability to deter and dominate. In a conflict situation, China possesses a larger and a more modernized fleet, including fifth-generation aircraft, advanced long-range bombers, and a strong inventory of unmanned vehicles and hypersonic weapons. So India, by contrast, suffers from a depleted squadron strength with aging aircraft and delays in induction of indigenous platforms. Technologically, China, supported by a robust domestic industry, is well ahead of India in air power assets. The asymmetry enables China to project air superiority and coerce India strategically, weakening India's deterrence and allowing China to shape the security environment in the region. So, how do we bridge the gap? Of course, there is an urgency. Without credible air power, India risks being strategically coerced and tactically surprised in any future confrontation. There is a strategic urgency to bridge this gap. It is not merely an operational issue, but it is a matter of national security. Credible deterrence cannot rest on outdated platforms and limited air assets. India must urgently reduce this widening gap to shift the cost-benefit analysis for China, making aggressive moves riskier and less attractive. So to conclude, China is no longer a rising power to be watched. It is a risen power to be reckoned with. Its global ambitions, assertive foreign policy, and rapid military modernization have reshaped the geopolitical environment in which India must operate. The consequences of this transformation are already playing out in India's immediate strategic environment. While symbolic phrases like dragon elephant tango may sound attractive, India must evaluate them against the backdrop of hard strategic realities. Partnership cannot come at the cost of territorial integrity, sovereignty, or strategic autonomy. It is imperative for India to respond with clarity, resolve, and capability. The window for bridging the military and technological gap is just narrowing. To maintain strategic autonomy, protect our territorial integrity, and preserve peace through strength, India must urgently develop its air power and overall military capabilities. We must abandon illusions of parity and embrace the hard work of building capability, especially in air power. Our aim is not to match China pound for pound, but is to acquire a minimum credible deterrent. As in the world we live in today, strength respects strength. And diplomacy without strength is a conversation without consequence. So it is our turn to actually act and rise. Thank you.